Okay, we are recording our class. This is our eighth class on Nabokov's Russian novels. We are first continuing with the I, and during the second half of the class, we will focus on the first part of the reading of Glory. So, starting with a hypothesis about what's going on in the I. I don't want to put you on the spot, Jerry, because you were not in class, but we devoted an hour and a half trying to figure it out, and we kind of arrived at something, but maybe if you want to share your theory or your questions.
It would definitely be a question, not a theory. I mean, I obviously felt that part of what he was trying to do here was to use art to comment on and describe the kind of self-consciousness or self-awareness or hyper self-consciousness that plague us all from time to time. But I have to say, I was very surprised when we got to the point in the novel where, in fact, we realized that the person who was being described earlier by the narrator was, in fact, the same person that everybody else was struggling with, Smirov.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I have a theory. It was an interesting struggle, so to speak.
Yeah, and
I'm anxious to hear whatever. I was going to say, I was just anxious to hear what Bonnie and Ed had to say.
Obviously, this kind of complication has to have some meaning, some function in the story. It's not just a curious device without any intention. So that's what we need to discover. But Bonnie and Ed, do you want to add something to our hypothesis from last time? Do we have actually one hypothesis? Where are we with this? Both of you want to start?
Bonnie.
Well, I don't know if we have a hypothesis, because sometimes I think the narrator and, well, Smirnov is the narrator, and he's looking, and he's dead. I mean, sometimes I think he's dead, and sometimes I think he's not dead. And I still haven't decided if it's just like a stream of consciousness and he's looking back at things, or if he's really dead and he's looking down and seeing other people's opinions of him.
And how to situate this in time, when exactly is this happening, and also whether he's dead or not actually is important, but also until we learn, although there are several hints that this is the same person, the observer and the observed are the same, until this becomes obvious, we have to answer the question whether Smurov is aware of being watched by the narrator, and whether the narrator believes Smurov knows about him. What is it?
And I think we talked about last week about how Smurov is really devoid of personality, and he's looking at the others for some kind of identity in himself, because in some conversations he's portrayed as an adventurer. Another one he's portrayed, I don't know, was he a lover in one, or he was in love with the one woman. And we talked a little bit about like the little man not having any personality.
Yeah, so that's something we started talking about, the little man, the everyman in Russian literature, 19th century Russian literature, as a character in its own writes, and we can talk a little bit about it. It's more of probably standing for some such character. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Ed, you're...
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm still a little bit confused about, there are a couple of instances where the narrator claims that he stopped thinking about Smirnov, right? I mean, there's, and how that happens and what is occurring as he sort of steps back from who we now can claim is himself. And so what is he doing while Smirnov is kind of acting? Because at least in one instance, when he's acting, I think the narrator even says something like, that's when Smirnov started to have the relationship with the maid. And it's almost as if the narrator is catching up on Smirnov's life as he kind of takes a step back. And so, I mean, I don't have any answers, but I was sort of fascinated by like what could be occurring in the narrator's mind as the character that he is still seemingly sort of acting in life in some fashion.
Okay, so I think just to clarify, you were referring to page 69. There follows a brief period when I stopped watching Smurov.
Yeah, exactly.
So because in this, at this point, we are given a very clear hint that the narrator is experiencing things that Smurov should be experiencing with the Russian family. All of a sudden, Smurov is not there. He's not being watched any longer. But the story continues in the first person. I grew heavy, surrendered again by the knowing of gravity, dawned anew my former flesh. And then once on Christmas before a ball to which we were all going without me, they were all going without me, I glimpsed. So that's all the narrator talking for 3 pages. And then gradually my attention returned to Smurov, right? 69, 70, and 71, the narrator is alone. Not alone, but not watching Smurov and telling us what's happening to Smurov, having his own experiences. So that's some indication that they are one, maybe. So several things then. Maybe we should start from the beginning in order to arrive at something. If you want to go back to page 7, remember how he's recommended by this Matilda as a tutor, and he has the 2 boys. It works perfectly well, by the way, in English with the 2 pupils watching him, right? It's not the same in the Russian, but in English it works great with the title, The Eye, and with the 2 pupils watching him, counting his cigarettes, seeing the humiliating experience of being beaten by Kashmarin. But I wanted us to pay attention to one particular passage on page 7 when he already is Matilda's lover. Maybe starting from the very beginning of the paragraph with often as I trudged home, because what I have in mind is a little bit lower, but maybe read from the beginning. Bonnie, if you can read to us.
Often as I trudged home, my cigarette case empty, my face burning in the oriel breeze as if I had just removed theatrical makeup, every step sending a throb of pain echoing through my head, I would inspect my puny little bliss from this side and that, and marvel and pity myself, and feel despondent and afraid. The summit of lovemaking was for me but a bleak knoll with relentless view. After all, in order to live happily, A man must know now and then a few moments of perfect blankness. Yet I was always exposed, always wide-eyed. Even in sleep, I did not cease to watch over myself, understanding nothing of my existence, growing crazy at the thought of not being able to stop being aware of myself and envying all those simple people, clerks, revolutionaries, shopkeepers, who with confidence and concentration go about their little jobs. I had no shell of that kind, and on those terrible pastel blue mornings, as my heels tapped across the wilderness of the city, I would imagine somebody who goes mad because he begins to perceive clearly the motion of the terrestrial sphere. There he is.
Maybe we should stop here because it enters another topic. But in this particular paragraph, he says that the moments of perfect blankness are necessary for people should forget themselves, should stop watching themselves at some point. And he was not able to stop watching himself, observing himself. And that's on page 7. I did not cease to watch over myself, understanding nothing of my existence, growing crazy at the thought of not being able to stop being aware of myself, etc. So I thought this is a suggestion that this character, before anything else has happened to him, is watching himself. This state of self-observation never leaves him alone. Not only that, but he's watching himself and is being watched by the two boys at the same time. This double watching. The observation is dual somehow here. The observed observes himself and is being observed at the same time. So this makes me think that nothing new happens later when he's beaten, shamed, humiliated, etc. And when he goes to the room that he inhabited before. So if we just go forward to page 20, that's after the suicide, when we probably should assume he's dead. But on page 20, the first sentence of the new section that starts with sometime later. Sometime later, if one can speak here of time at all, it became clear that after that, human thought lives on by momentum. And then continuing, maybe we should read again this. It's interspersed with other details, but on the next page, 6-7 lines into the page, what a mighty thing was human thought, that it could hurtle on beyond death. So death is presented as a fact, or at least perceived to be a fact, and thought remains. And then page 22, again, I assume that the posthumous momentum of my thought, that's already taken for granted. And finally, we have an explanation of sorts. Ed, if you could read on page 23, 7 lines into the page, for I knew now.
For I knew now that after death, human thought, liberated from the body, keeps on moving in a sphere where everything is interconnected as before and has a relative degree of sense, and that a sinner's torment in the afterworld consists precisely in that his tenacious mind cannot find peace until it manages to unravel the complex consequences of his reckless terrestrial actions.
Okay, thank you. So this statement here that this thought continues after that because it can't find peace, because there is some unfinished business, is nothing new. Of course, people who believe in vampires and spirits, etc., believe that they remain precisely because they have some unfinished business. It could be because they were not properly buried. It could be because they were murdered and they're looking for revenge, all kinds of things. But there is something unfinished, and then the momentum of thought seems to continue because there is something remaining that needs to be considered, reconsidered, finished, maybe rediscovered, relived, I would say. And this, now I'm venturing to present my hypothesis. This makes me think that what is happening further is partially an experience of the past, the Russian family, and partially an experience of the present for the thought, the momentum of the thought. The thought continues to explore those unresolved situations of the past somehow, but this is not happening in the past. It's not exactly memory, but it's reliving it. That's my suspicion, what's going on here. And because he's reliving it, and because he was observing himself even before, it is easier for the narrator to continue as an observer, because the narrator is the tutor, right? And the tutor is Smurov. Later, we understand. So all three are one, but divided into an observant, an observed, an observer here. And I think it's not an entirely new thing that's happening, the interaction with the Russian family. And another reason to think so is because it's in the same building where he lived. It's not a new place for him. So it could be something related to his past, reliving this past experience, but at the same time, because at the end he meets Kashmarin, who kind of apologizes for beating him up, we know it is not in the past. It is some future exploration of the past in which the observer sees the observed in different situations. I don't know if it makes sense. Was it too confused as a proposal?
Well, I mean, for me, where it seems difficult is that he does seem to, even after he kills himself, kind of pick up where he lets off, right? In the sense that, you know, he goes to the bookstore and, you know, there is sort of an immediate, like, well, you look terrible. And as you might expect if someone, you know, was recovering. And then it just seems like it kind of chronologically goes on as if it's not a reliving, that it's a carrying on of you know, a life that he had left behind, right? And so he now gets the job of the guy that got fired, and so you don't, at least in this is why it's hard for me to grasp a reliving.
I didn't mean a repetition, in not repeated events, but he knew this bookstore, he knew the proprietor before. He's not meeting new people. He's meeting people that he knew before. That's my sense. And reliving the relationship with them, not the same event happening again, not an event of the past being relived, but in a sense, a continuation of relationships, but continuation that is somehow related to the unresolved from the previous life somehow. So for instance, the love story with Vanya, I don't think he meets her first time now as Smurov only being observed by the narrator. But my sense is it's the same building, it's the same Russian family. He must have met her before, but
Yeah, and I mean, it's strange in this sense too that he, like even when he starts to try to write his suicide notes, he can't identify someone who he might even write them to. And so that's why it seems to me that the Russian family is new and those people are new characters that are being introduced. And then again, he doesn't have this, I mean, presumably if he had met them previously, they might be identified as potential recipients of, his suicide notes, I guess. And I think this is why it's still strange to me, is because we don't really know much about his past. I mean, I think he's asked a question about his parents, and he kind of gives this kind of cryptic, like they're in some cemetery, somewhere. And we really don't experience any of the previous things that he might be reliving as you suggest. So,
in general, we don't know anything about him, really. Yeah. We know that he was recommended to be a tutor, but we know that he lived in this room, right?
Yes.
But with the room, the problem is when he parts with Vanya, at the end, when she tells him that there is no hope, etc. When he buys the lilies of the valley, the big bouquet, he goes to his landlady, where the room is in which he supposedly committed suicide. Mm-hmm. So where is this room? It looks like when they give him the second set of the keys that they live in the same building, because he has forgotten his keys, so he gets the second set from them. Apparently it should be the same building, right? And yet when he buys the lilies of the valleys, the room is occupied already by somebody else. So Smurov doesn't really live in this room after the suicide, but he's somehow in the building and visits the Russian family, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit of a difficulty. But if he is this momentum of thought, right, that doesn't need a space and perceives time differently, as he seems to say, if there is, where is it? Sorry. The third part that starts, okay, sometime later, if one can speak here of time at all. What is time for this unwinding, actually, thought? So
is the idea, Katya, that actually the events that sort of seem to take place after his suicide are actually a revisiting of the past, so that he's kind of working backwards, where it kind of seems like it's just kind of maybe just going forward as it naturally might, but the suggestion you're making is that he's actually kind of back in the past, recreating some events that were, say, more troublesome and maybe more reckless than simply, getting beaten by, an old man because he was.
Could it be that these are all new events that are kind of imagined, reimagining some relationships with the family? Do you think? I mean, because we don't have a clear indication of what's past and what's present and what's future here, because time is jumbled together, we might not even need to place them chronologically anywhere. But what's interesting is these events somehow give birth to different selves. Smurov's whatever self he has or had now doesn't seem to exist. And my doubt is whether he had a self at all. This character from the beginning seemed to be somebody who corresponds to the image of the small man in Russian literature, who essentially doesn't have a self. I mean, if you have read Bartleby the Scrivener, Melville's story, that corresponds to stories by Russian writers such as Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky's Poor Folk, Chekhov, Man in a Case, Gogol, The Overcoat. I mentioned them last time, but these are all characters that don't really have a self. They're somehow defined by the others. And I suspect this is what Nabokov might be doing here, inventing a character that is a continuation of the kind of everyman that is everyman also in the sense that he is whatever the others perceive in him. And there is nothing else but this. That's a possibility here. So maybe we don't even need to answer the question whether this is happening indeed, whether it is imagined, reimagined, relived, rediscovered, or without the RE, imagined, created, discovered. I'm not sure it matters that much. But the important thing is there is the observed Smurov and the observer narrator, the dividedness of the character.
Do both, I guess, the narrator and Smurov, though, kind of contribute to, I guess, the image that those folks around him think about him, right? I mean, if he fits in that category of the small man where he's kind of defined by others, he certainly seems to contribute to whether it's either by not filling in details or just generally being mysterious, or even at least in one instance kind of lying about his military wound and his escape from the enemy. I mean, he's at least contributing to his the way in which others construe him, as opposed to just simply being kind of defined by those around him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very interesting. When he tells the story about Yalta and Mukhin tells him, unfortunately, there is no railway station there. That's one interesting point, that he kind of gives them material to which they respond, and this feedback he gets, it's like a mirror of sorts, right? And mirrors seem important here, especially towards the end. So in a sense, he's trying to find himself in the others as mirror, the way we look in the mirror to see ourselves. He's doing this with other people somehow, and we can go over the distances, the different instances here. Yeah, Jerry, your thoughts so far?
Well, certainly mirrors are extremely important. On page 103, when we get to the end of the story, maybe it's premature to go there, but he's both reflecting himself back to himself and speculating on how his reflection is received by others. And then he makes the point where, and then will come the day when the last person who remembers me will die. And that's a profound statement that we all have to live with, right, in one way or another. So he's he's every man in a different way, almost, when we get to the end of the story.
Yeah, but maybe that's the only truth, actually. I mean, we think of ourselves as having something that the others might or might not know, notice, etc. That we are an entity in itself, regardless of the others. But in fact, what he says here is the moment the last person who remembered him is gone, he won't exist. And
Right.
there is truth. There is truth in this. More truth than appears on the surface. That's why he's so thrilled with the diary, the
Mm-hmm.
Roman. Oh, I forgot his patronymic. Writing the letters and sending them to Tallinn,
Mm-hmm.
of all places. Regardless of what he says there, he imagines he's going to live in those papers in the future. It's already something, good or bad. It almost doesn't matter.
Well, it's interesting that at that point in time, excuse me, we're not sure yet that the narrator and Smirnoff are the same person.
Right.
Yeah. So he's going through all of these different acts and exercises to try to discover what others are going to be saying about Smirnoff. Yet we're not sure yet. I wasn't, as a reader, hadn't got to the point where I associated the narrator and Smirnoff as being the same person.
So speaking of the letter, it's I thought it was Smorov who goes to the house. I'm just trying to find it. And waits there for hours until midnight. It's about page 77, I thought. I recall that's the very thought that Smorov's image might be so securely, so lastingly preserved. I felt a sacred chill. So it's the narrator who stands there by the house where Roman Bogdanovich lives. And the thing is, though, that Roman Bogdanovich thinks of him as Smurov. So that's an indication that they're the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we have the eye of the narrator telling us the story, so the narrator thinks that Roman is creating an image, perhaps immortal, of Smurov, etc. But then, when Roman Bogdanovich appears, he says on page 81, with the letter in hand, the last 10 lines, I'll mail it, I shouted, it's on my way, it's on my way. Again, I had time to glimpse an expression of alarm and uncertainty on his face. But the thing is, he's not a stranger to Roman Bogdanovich. He says, what manners you have, right? Perhaps I had no intention to post it. I'm in a hurry, goodbye, goodbye. So looks like
But
it. Yeah, go ahead.
Couldn't it have been, he would have been familiar with the narrator anyway. I mean, earlier in the novel, yeah, as a almost as a separate character. So,
unnamed one.
Unnamed narrator, yes.
Okay, so now that's an interesting hypothesis then, that the narrator is a part of this little group of Russians,
Mm-hmm.
and Smorov is somebody else. They're two people. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe.
Well, they could be the same person, but Bogdanovich doesn't necessarily let me know as a reader that he's seeing Smurov if I'm not aware that Smurov and the narrator are the same.
Right. Right. Bogdanovich, I mean, the point of view is entirely the one of the narrator throughout, from the beginning. The narrator as a tutor, the narrator committing suicide and all that. So we don't know what Roman Bogdanovich thought at all. But I was just suggesting that this is one of the hints that they might be one. And later several times too. It starts earlier and is here. So
I mean, I guess, Katya, I just took it that like, sort of the curiosity of the narrator about sort of Smurov's immortality made it clear that they were kind of one and the same, in that it would seem strange to me that the narrator would particularly care that someone other than himself might have kind of this lasting history through the diary. I guess that's how I.
Yeah, that's actually, that sounds very logical to me. Why should he care so much about Smurov in general? Why does this narrator care so much about Smurov throughout, if they're different? We, without revealing anything about the reasons for caring, we don't know much about him. But for me, the main thing is I know the narrator is the tutor from the beginning. I as a reader believe that it's the same I telling me the story. And then I know that this statement about human thought remaining and somehow living on afterwards by momentum, this statement has been made several times. And so I'm thinking, what does he do with the thought? Where does he go with this? And if he employs this thought just with observation of Smurov, there has to be a reason. Yeah. But yeah, we're not told directly in any way until the end that they're the same. Yeah.
And the next page, we're introduced to this term "sexual lefties" that Bogdanovich views Smurov, and we find out later, or maybe here, that the narrator and Smurov are the same person. That there's this view of Smurov as being somehow, I presume, gay.
Interested in him.
Yeah.
Interested
in
Roman Bogdanovich.
Yes.
Yeah, in the letter. It is, the novel is very interesting precisely because it shows different perceptions, how a different Smurov can appear depending on who observes him, and then what kind of story he feeds the observer, if there is a story or behavior. So I don't know, I can't remember whether I talked about the meaning of the names, by the way, last time. Kashmarin means, Kashmar is nightmare, So it's in his name. Smurov probably comes from Sumrov, which means dead or dying. UMR, Sumrov, Smurov, Sumrov, Umrov, dying, and also we have Muhin, the fiancé, Vanya's fiancé, that's a fly, and at the end we learn that he has witnessed the conversation between Vanya and Smurov, as a fly on the wall. To not that it matters that much, but I think Smurov means that he is dead. His name suggests that he's dead, and Kashmarin could be a real beating, could be the fear of some kind of revenge, both in the beginning and in the end. I don't know what to take as true and what to take as imagined or relived or created. I take the point of suicide as a dividing line. Everything that happens after the suicide seems to be a result of thought momentum as opposed to reality. The fact that he so easily switches from the story he tells to Mariana, what was her last name? I think it's about page 44. When he presents himself when he misinterprets the poem. Sorry, I'll find it right now. She disappears later. So that's before the story about his heroic exploits.
The misquoting of the poem, I think, is on 34.
Okay, thank you. 34. So he's misquoting a poem in a way that he turns it exactly upside down. This is a poem by Nekrasov, and in fact, although the first line is from the poem, everything else that he says later is exactly the opposite, because the poem is about the lyric speakers is sorry about the mother. He speaks about war as a terrible experience for mothers. So he turns everything upside down when he speaks with Mariana, and presents himself as a person who probably he is not. There is nothing to confirm that he possesses the military gallantry that he's defending here. But she thinks about him that way, or the narrator believes she thinks about him based on this conversation. And I'm just thinking if we go deeper with this, there is so much more in it, how we form opinions, an image of somebody based on what we hear from the person. So he talks with different people and they see him entirely differently. Although they're the same family, these are not strangers to each other. And people don't even think that they're imagining it. They think this is what they're perceiving throughout. So on the one hand, he doesn't have a self, apparently, or at least we don't know of any self. On the other hand, he is looking for a self in the reflection in others, and then he's not happy with those reflections. He wants a specific one. He wants Vanya to like him. He wants her to commit to him and not to Muhin. And he's the only one who hasn't noticed that there is a relationship going on there. Yeah, Jerry? Your mic, Jerry, your mic.
Sorry, just didn't want to cough all over everybody.
No
In the English, there's a conflation between I and I-E-Y-E.
Yeah.
How does that play in the Russian?
It doesn't.
It doesn't?
No.
Because it seems so important to this novel.
Right. But I think this is one of the cases, like with the two pupils. I think this is absolutely ingenious in English. And the Russian word is sagladatai. Oh, the I at the end has nothing to do with an I. So it is a spy, really, an informer. So somebody who observes, definitely. But here the I, although the I also has the connotation with a spy, it is just so ingenious because it is the I, the personal pronoun. I think it works much, much better in English than in Russian. And yeah, Ed and then Bonnie.
I'm just going to say it seems that his desire is to be as you suggest, that Vanya will be the thing that he kind of eventually wants his image to be like that would be kind of the happiest result if he could be with her. But he does seem, at least in telling the story about Yalta, that he might somewhat be okay with being perceived as being, this kind of military adventure kind of fellow. And I mean, there's obviously other iterations, where Weinstock thinks he's some kind of double agent or triple agent or something like that. And kind of the odd response of Smirnoff to that is that eventually it would kind of fade away because there wasn't any sort of proof of the matter. Like there just wasn't enough actual evidence. So he might desire to be known as that, but he's afraid that eventually people will, they just won't have any basis for making it over some period of time.
Yeah, it's almost like it's better to be somebody regardless of what than be nobody. But he could be so many different things if he's nobody. He could be this kind of hero or the other kind of hero, or a spy or a lover or just anything, just because he's nobody. And a writer actually should embrace this state of things to be everybody, right? But Smorov doesn't seem to be happy with this. He wants some reflection in the mirror, not an empty mirror somehow. And
what's wrong with being a tutor? I mean, that's something, I mean, to be
that's something, but they watch him, they count his cigarettes, he feels watched, he watches himself. So I guess he's not even, he's nominally a tutor, but he doesn't allow himself to be anything but a watched one.
And he doesn't even defend himself when he's being beaten up. He just keeps running, and he never even tries to stop the beating.
Right.
And I found that interesting.
And I think we mentioned, but the beating is a very peculiar thing. I mean, it should be a duel of sorts, something more, I guess.
More virile.
Yeah, something more characteristic of the Russian aristocracy, we kind of feel he has the manners of somebody who comes from a good family, but we know nothing about it. And I don't know, there is something about the beating, and then the way it is resolved at the end, meeting Kashmarin, who is offering him a deal. That's a little bit strange too. If he hadn't met Kashmarin after that, you could hypothesize that all that is happening, all the Russian family and all that, is mostly some kind of memories from the past, relived, transformed, the unfinished business of the past. But some time has passed between the beating and meeting Kashmarin again. So it looks like real time is passing, and it looks like Kashmarin is real.
Yeah, and just to pick up, Kati, what you said about kind of Smirnov's background, I think it's on page 34 where weirdly or strangely it's kind of the narrator who's looking at Smirnov. We don't know, I don't think that they're the same person yet, and I think he's the one that suggests that, you know, observing Smirnov, he belonged to the best of St. Petersburg society. So it's almost, again, the narrator himself, where you would expect that from Smirnov as you kind of get to know him, that he kind of creates these images that he might not be. But it's here that the narrator himself is kind of creating an image of Smirnov that, again, I don't know if we can verify that that's true or not, as you suggested.
Mm-hmm.
He's a blank page of sorts that is going to be filled in by the narrator. And behind the narrator, of course, we have Nabokov, but maybe that would be the next step to figure out this triple relationship: character, narrator, and author. Bonnie, you were about to speak.
No, it was just a question, and I don't know if it means anything. In the beginning of the book, where there's different breaks, they have a bold capital letter, and then all of a sudden that just stops.
Yeah.
And does that,
Yeah.
am I supposed to take something from that?
I think you are. Did you?
What I thought I took from it can't be, because I thought, well, maybe once he died and he's reflecting back, or he's looking at other people's opinions or other people's ideas of his identity, that's when the bold stopped. But I don't think that fits.
Well, it actually does. First of all, it's not in the original. It's not in the Russian original, by the way. The Russian original is divided into 6 sections. I personally divided this into my own sections, and I have 1, 2, 3, and in 3 I have 15 sections, just the way the action develops. He has not done this. But the third, that starts with sometime later, you see, is kind of uninterrupted flow. Although there are events within it, and sometimes the narrator leaves Smirnov and continues to write about himself, it's almost like from this point on, as you suggested, it is one, I don't know, it's not the line, but the story now isn't interrupted in the way, I guess anything that exists beyond time should be uninterrupted. And it's also the 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. On the third time, something happens. But I'm sure everybody has noticed this, and it creates expectations. Creates the expectation that other sections would start similarly, right? And it never happens. I'm curious, it was published in the Playboy I think in 3 issues, one after the other, how they divided it. And I
But it
don't
was
know.
published in Playboy after Lolita, right? After the publication of Lolita.
Yeah, because this is translated. What year was it translated? I forgot now, but about 30 years later, right?
Yeah.
Well, Nabokov couldn't ever hope to get to Playboy before Lolita. So it was translated.
It was in Playboy in 1965.
Oh, yeah, that's almost, I
Lolita
mean,
was 57, right?
7 years, 8 years after Lolita.
I'm only just
How many?
fantasizing. I'm
Sorry.
just fantasizing that Hugh Hefner's interest in Nabokov. I mean, they obviously for Nabokov to branch out into the popular press in the United States, something very important to him. But the reasons for his wanting to publish in a periodical like Playboy and Hefner's desire to have him publish were two very
Probably.
different reasons.
Yes, I'm sure. But it's interesting, Playboy has published several important interviews, like with Saul Bellow as well.
Yes.
And I haven't gone to back issues. I don't even know whether they're available online or haven't done any search. But there was a period when they really had some literary ambitions. And but I wonder how this was divided, and I don't know how it was perceived, honestly. I mean, just those who read it in 3 installments, what did they get of it? Where was the sex?
Mm-hmm.
None of it. Okay, to return to this. So I think he must have made Bonnie a conscious decision to just let it go like a river after this point, not divide it. It's not necessarily a flow, but graphically creates this sense. So, do you mind reading the ending and discussing it a little bit? Because I thought it might give us some insight. So that's after meeting Kashmarin. On page 100, 101, this is when we probably finally realize for sure that Smurov is the narrator, because this is how Kashmarian addresses him. But after the space on page 102, starting with Kashmarian, Jerry, I'm not asking you to read. Would you like to read?
I can try. And then
why don't you
somebody else
save your
can bail
voice
me out.
to speak
All
to
right.
tell us? Bonnie and Ed will forgive me that I'll exploit them as readers today. Bonnie, would
Thank
you
you.
start?
Where Kashmarian had borne
Right.
okay. Kashmarian had borne away yet another image of Shmurov. Does it make any difference which? For I do not exist. There exist but the thousands of mirrors that reflect me. With every acquaintance I make, the population of phantoms resembling me increases. Some where they live, some where they multiply. I alone do not exist. Smurov, however, will live on for a long time. The 2 boys, those pupils of mine, will grow old, and some image or other of me will live within them like a tenacious parasite. And then will come the day when the last person who remembers me will die, a fetus in reverse. My image, too, will dwindle and die within that last witness of the crime I committed by the mere fact of living. Perhaps a chance story about me, a simple anecdote in which I figure will pass on from him to his son or grandson, and so my name and my ghost will appear fleetingly here and there for some time still. then will come the end.
Thank you. Ed?
And yet I am happy. Yes, happy. I swear I'm happy. I realize that the only happiness in this world is to observe, to spy, to watch, to scrutinize oneself and others, to be nothing but a big, slightly vitreous, somewhat bloodshot, unblinking eye. I swear that this is happiness. What does it matter that I am a bit cheap, a bit foul, and that no one appreciates all the remarkable things about me, my fantasy, my erudition, my literary gift? I am happy that I can gaze at myself, for any man is absorbing, yes, really absorbing. The world, try as it may, cannot insult me. I am invulnerable. And what do I care if she marries another? Every other night I dream of her dresses and things on an endless clothesline of bliss in the ceaseless wind of possession, and her husband shall never learn what I do to the silks and fleece of the dancing witch. This is love's supreme accomplishment. I am happy, yes, happy. What more can I do to prove it? How to proclaim that I am happy? Oh, to shout it so that all of you believe me at last, you cruel, smug people.
Thank you very much. It's a peculiar ending. Does
Is
he
he really happy though? Because like
right.
he's protesting too much. He keeps saying he's happy, and I just don't think he's happy.
Otherwise, he wouldn't be protesting so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what if we take him at his words? What is it that makes him happy?
I mean, to some extent, it's the dreams of the thing that he doesn't actually have. I mean, he in his kind of mind is possessing her, Vanya, but he doesn't really, but it seems to him sufficient that he is either dreaming about her or can kind of fantasize about her.
Imagination,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
He has, what does he have? Just a second, Bonnie. He says that what he has is my fantasy, my erudition, my literary gift. That's what he has. And thanks to this, he is invulnerable and he can imagine, create whatever he wishes. And nobody can prevent him from doing this. Yes, Bonnie, and then Jerry.
So I was going to say, is that a comment that Nabokov is making about himself? Mm-hmm. That he has this fantasy, this literary gift, and it's a commentary on his own art, his own craft, his own intelligence.
It could be, or could the narrator be different from Nabokov somehow?
I was going to ask, I agree with Bonnie, that came to mind reading this paragraph, but what evidence do we have in the novel of having any kind of a literary gift other than what we're reading here?
You're not told that.
Well, for me, that could be maybe the letters in the diary. Would he consider that a literary gift?
But they're not his.
They're not his, but he's
Roman Bogdanovich's.
But he's considered in them. No.
Oh, he's considered there, but as a gifted writer, or
no, that he is a literary gift, that he's included in those letters, that he was thought, that Bogdanovich thought enough about him or included him, so it kind of made him a literary gift. I think that's a little far-fetched. I don't believe that.
Yeah, he has not written anything but this narrative that we're.
That's what made me think of
Nabokov.
Nabokov, yeah.
Nabokov, though, has created a narrator as a separate, as a character separate from himself. And this, I'm happy, yes, happy, I swear. Oh, to shout it so that all of you believe me at last, you cruel, smug people. I have difficulties hearing Nabokov's voice here. There might be irony in it, and then it might somewhat work, but I think he's creating a narrator that is different from his narrator in other stories. The all-knowing narrator. Here we have narrator that speaks in first person, a typical unreliable narrator in this case. We don't know what's true, what's untrue, what are his premises, what are his what is his agenda. This narrator is a character speaking in first person, and all the other books we read this quarter, including Glory that we're starting, they're in third person. It's omniscient narrator usually who might follow one point of view of one character, kind of subjectively, but then all of a sudden jump into another head and tell us what's there. We saw it, for instance, very much with King, Queen, Knave, right? But he usually chooses to follow one person. Luzhin is followed that way, but then for a moment we see Mrs. Luzhin, for instance, we see the father, their perspectives, and it's always a third person omniscient narrator, which is entirely broken here. It is a narrator who speaks directly in first person to us. So he becomes a character. This narrator is a character above all. Could he be actually very unhappy the way he is? If we take it that he protests too much, that he's trying to convince not us, not the cruel, smug people, but himself that he is happy. Because he has told us somewhere they live, somewhere they multiply, the Smurovs. I alone do not exist. I alone do not exist, and yet I'm happy. I'm happy, I'm very happy. So I'm just thinking that this narrator has reasons to be very unhappy, actually.
Well, and then further on, he said that his only happiness is to observe and to spy and to watch others.
To gaze at myself.
So that's kind of
gazing at himself. That's his fulfillment. But
so
he doesn't exist. Sorry, Bon.
Oh no, so I think that's why he's not very happy, because that's his only happiness, is to scrutinize himself and others, and that's it.
And why shouldn't this be a satisfying occupation?
Well, there's I guess there's no companionship, no love. It's kind of lonesome if all you're doing is watching yourself and other people. And it's kind of it's a lonesome.
It looks like all these Smurovs are not aware of him, the narrator, watching them, gazing at them, right? All the many Smurovs. So while the narrator is living vicariously, he's also very lonely in this vicariousness. Sorry, Ed, you've been waiting.
No, I was just gonna say, like, it seems a strange kind of perversion of kind of the Socratic mandate to know yourself, right? I mean,
Yes.
it doesn't really, ring true in this instance that he's absorbed with kind of his own sort of navel gazing about what he is. Like you don't feel like his exercise is the same as what might be demanded by the sort of Socratic dictate, and it just seems kind of pathetic in a way, that he feels like he can sort of get away with having any sort of tangible things that other people might kind of say make you happy, whether that's, I don't know whether it's fame or whether it's money or whether it's knowledge, whatever it is, but he seems to feel comfortable just saying none of those earthly terrestrial things matter as long as I'm sort of thinking about myself. Just seems.
But where is the self is the thing. I mean, know thyself only exists if there is a self to be known, right?
Fair point, right?
And
As you say, if there's a knower,
if
the
there is a
knower
knower,
seems to be missing.
right? So the knower is just an I observing. He doesn't say, I want to know Smurov. He creates Smurov. He looks at reflections. And he doesn't exist, and Smurov seems to exist only as long as the others perceive his existence one way or other. So there is a scene with the mirrors in the florist shop where the image disappears. The reflection, that reflection and I merged into one. As I pushed the door. So that's, we actually didn't discuss this, the I, it looks like on page 96, the I selects this big bouquet of lilies of the valley. And then at the end of the long paragraph on page 97, I notice, as I push the door, I notice the reflection in the side mirror. A young man in a derby carrying a bouquet hurried toward me. So that's his own reflection, right? The reflection and I merged into one as he gets very close to the mirror. I walked out into the street. The reflection must disappear, and now he has merged into one with the other. But if the I is the observer and says that he doesn't exist, it is, I mean, okay, I got lost here in my thought. He goes back to see his own room with the flowers. The landlady is happy about the flowers, but then he's taking them to send them to Vanya, right? On page 100. So if he has committed suicide and he arrives with the bouquet of lilies of the valley to this apartment as if she thinks he wants to rent the room again, how are we to take this event? The landlady, either the landlady belongs to the level of imagined, reimagined figures, or he hasn't died then. And this idea of the thought continuing after is more of a metaphor.
Katya, there's the kind of a couple of passages before that where he talks about the fact that this dream that he was living in starts to become the reality again. And so as he needs to go back to the room to kind of prove to himself that he actually did kill himself. And so there's this odd need, like the events are unfolding where the thing that is otherwise a dream is almost becoming too real to him, and he has to confirm that that's actually not true. And for some reason, the bullet hole is the sort of linchpin of bringing him back to, oh no, this is actually just all the momentum of my thought, I guess.
That's very interesting.
He said he had to rudely disprove that I was a ghost.
Yeah, that's exactly the passage I'm thinking
Yeah.
about.
It is frightening when real life suddenly turns out to be a dream, but how much more frightening when that which one had thought a dream, fluid and irresponsible, suddenly starts to congeal into reality. I had to put a stop to this, and I knew how to do it. I thought that was a very telling, interesting paragraph.
Yeah, that's, I can't find the page now.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's on page 98.
Yeah, okay.
Like the fourth line in.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I marked it. Yeah, that's
the strangeness of like when he does see the mark of the bullet, his kind of immediate thought is that somehow the world around him immediately regained its reassuring insignificance. I was strong once again, nothing could hurt me again. So somehow he's better off not actually having well, I'm not sure the reality or whatever it is he thinks he gains from reminding himself that he was able to kill himself.
Yeah, an interesting thing is the adjective, the secret mark.
Mm-hmm.
The secret mark of my bullet. It was my proof that I had really died. What if he hasn't died? Maybe there was a bullet, but he was saved. Maybe in the hospital, his life was saved. For some reason, he prefers to have died. That's what he'd rather be, dead rather than alive. I think Brian Boyd suggests that this is the humiliation of the beating. So whether he's dead or not, he's dead psychologically, kind of, he doesn't want to live after this beating. It is so humiliating for him that it is like having died. I don't know if this is necessarily a solution here.
I can't find it now, Katya, but somewhere towards the end, I think we just read it about his commitment of a crime. And I know that last class, we tried to figure out, I don't think we talked about the crime, but we talked about the reckless action that he needs to sort of fix before he can rest in peace. And what we just read about his like, just by the fact of living, he committed a crime. And is there something, is there something else other than just sort of the adultery that is what, he's trying to almost sort of repent from? That he thinks is a crime. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question, a very interesting one. I don't have an immediate response, but you're referring to page 23, right? Cannot find peace until it manages to unravel the complex consequences of
Right.
his.
That's the one we talked about the first class, and then the on 103 we just read. You know,
Yeah,
within the last witness of the crime I committed by the mere fact of living. If that's,
the act of living as a crime.
I don't know if those two are connected, but that's.
Yeah, they might be. I mean, so fragile as life is, um, it can't just end. It, he can't be just annihilated. He can't just disappear. The thought remains that people are going to mention him, chat about him. He is going to appear in somebody's diary. So all the traces that remain in others, yeah, but the crime of living really, uh, it's in the very middle of page 103, right? A fetus in reverse, my image too will dwindle and die within that last witness of the crime committed by the mere fact of living. The last witness. Well, the whole vocabulary is a witness to a crime, um, some kind of transgression.
And that
So,
the
yeah.
the suicide or attempted suicide appeared to me to be such a strange reaction to the beating. It goes along with others. I think Bonnie mentioned that he didn't defend himself. He made no attempt to defend himself. That somehow having this happen to him in front of his two pupils, again, pupils, eyewitnesses, so to speak, that his only alternative was to end his life, which seemed very, very strange.
Yeah, I wonder whether it would have been that strange to the Russian reader.
Oh.
Because his dignity is absolutely annihilated by this action, being beaten in front of his two pupils. And what remains for him at this point is, I guess, to make the next step and extinguish himself somehow. But it is interesting that on the one hand, he's so sensitive to it. On the other hand, he doesn't have a circle of people who would think badly of him, knowing that he was beaten like this for such and such a reason and didn't even try to resist. So it is a very idealistic, abstract notion of humiliation, of his personal humiliation here. And I don't know, there is something about the event that doesn't sound right. It's, again, knowing other Russian novels, you see there is always a duel of swords. If these are people who would beat somebody, the other person is also of the same kind, so there will be mutual beating here. But his total lack of resistance is, I guess, a part of his being nobody. If he were to reflect the other here, he would have to respond in a similar way, right? And he didn't. Not because he felt guilty, right? We have to distinguish. It was not that he felt so guilty that it was like, okay, I deserve the punishment. Okay, any last words? I think in the second half we can compare this character with the character as much as we know him already from Glory, if you're interested in other characters from the previous novels. It's a unique character. I think it's definitely Nabokov's version of the small man here, who has no identity, no self, no identity, but has a narrator. And yeah, if you read any of the stories I mentioned, then I can send you the list of the small man in Russian literature. you will see what it might be about.
I was thinking about it too, and to the point that you were making about looking at this character, and then as we move on to Martin. And that's one of the beauties of reading these novels in the chronological order that they were written, because it seems to me that Nabokov is working something out here about how we develop or don't develop a sense of self, and what that sense of self looks like over time.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to compare Martin to.
Yeah, it would be interesting to compare also with Lev from Mary, with France, with Luzhin. I mean, these are all male characters that are kind of comparable. And France is the one, the young man who, it's the Bildungsroman young man who is initiated into mature life and all that. Okay, let's take 15 minutes break and I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, we're continuing this time with a new book, the last book in this quarter's Russian novels by Nabokov. So, as usual, first general impressions, and this time you can obviously talk not only about this book, but how it relates to everything else that you read by now. Very few people do what we're doing. I'm sure you realize this, but reading one writer chronologically is done usually by somebody who writes a dissertation on this writer. Otherwise, people might read everything, but at different points in time, and it doesn't feel the same. Anyway, so Martin Edelweiss, Bonnie.
Well, after just finishing the eye, what struck me was the straightforwardness so far of this narrative. And simplicity is probably too, it's a beautiful story from what I've read, and I don't know if I should be expecting some kind of a trap. Because so far, just what I've read, it's romantic, and I can see why, according to the his foreword, that he talked about maybe having, I think, romance or something in the title, and it kind of struck me that it was romantic with some of his descriptions, and so I'm waiting that there should be a trap somewhere.
Because the author is Nabokov.
Right. That it can't be this straightforward, and it can't be the simplicity in it and the romance. I'm waiting for someone, there has to be a suicide or a death or something.
But also put yourself in his shoes. He wants to rest a little bit and just write this story that's straightforward and full of sensual
Descriptions. Mm-hmm.
Descriptions, and do something as traditional as describing the grandfather and the mother and the father and the whole background, something that we didn't have at all, something totally missing, zero.
We have descriptions and we have full names.
Right.
So I was happy.
With Smirnov, we were told that they were buried at a cemetery. Was it, how was described, the cemetery described, not just far away, but was it in the old country? Something about the cemetery. And that's all we knew about him, really. Okay. This is a very traditional beginning, right? Starting with the grandfather. But the way the grandfather is described and the way the character thinks of the grandfather, although it's not first person, it is third person omniscient, but from the perspective of the character. For instance, Martin assumed at first that the velvety white alpine flower, that pet of herbariums, had been named in honor of his grandfather. I just love this. I mean, a kid, of course, could think something like, oh, this flower is called Edelweiss, like my grandpa. So they're really endearing moments. Okay, Jerry and Ed, your first impressions.
Well, it was a vastly different feel from the eye. I agree with Bonnie, having made the transition from one to the other, but I couldn't help but think that the struggle that Martin's going through in a different way, I think I mentioned this earlier, is part of the author's working something out here. I don't have any idea what yet, but
Okay, an exile. I mean, we have the idea of an exile, right, throughout. And self, again, and what happens to the self when it is extracted from its natural environment by some kind of imposition, a force that's external, the revolution and all that, which obviously we know from other books by Nabokov, but okay. Yeah, Ed?
Yeah, I got hung up early on something in the forward that I wish I hadn't. Talking about when Nabokov mentions that he didn't give Martin any talent.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
I have to be honest, I don't know what Nabokov's expectations are for young kids, but I think Martin exhibits a decent amount of talent that we might all think our kids to be lucky to have. And so I found myself sort of highlighting those instances where Martin actually displayed some talent, and I don't know if that was the right approach, but that's what sort of captured me early on, and I didn't agree that Martin, was someone who wasn't. I mean, he seemed fairly special and decent.
He seems very different from Smorov in this respect, right? There is genuine self to him that we perceive.
Yeah, I think so.
But just to finish, Bonnie, is this to what Ed said about the talent?
No.
But can we read in the forward what he says? My second one stroke. Ed, if you don't mind, page 13, Roman numbers in the forward.
Yeah, my second wand stroke is this. Among the gifts I showered on Martin, I was careful not to include talent. How easy it would have been to make him an artist, a writer, how hard not to let him be one, while bestowing on him the keen sensitivity that one generally associates with the creative creature. How cruel to prevent him from finding in art not an escape, which is only a cleaner cell on a quieter floor, but relief from the itch of being. The temptation to perform my own little exploit within the omnibus nimbus prevailed. The result reminded me of a chess problem I once composed.
Okay, and then he goes with the chess problem. So I wonder whether the word talent to Nabokov might mean something else. I read it that he says, I didn't make him a writer. I didn't make him an artist on purpose. He has the potential, he has the sensitivity. With this sensitivity, he could be, but Nabokov on purpose does not make him somebody who is primarily an artist. That's how I take it. When you underline things that you found to be expressions of talent, did you find anything that puts him in the category of a writer or visual artist? Or
I did not. I think it's other things, yeah.
It might mean simply that Nabokov uses the word with a slightly different meaning, kind of fulfilled potential for creativity almost on professional level.
Mm.
And what he's telling, we haven't read to the end, obviously, but what he's telling us, all this is not going to lead to him becoming a poet, a writer, an artist, but it's still here, right? The sensitivity, the compelling nature of the character is still here, but not everybody needs to become a writer or an artist, right? I mean, we could have the potential for it and not act upon it. And I suspect somebody like Nabokov cannot go very far from who he is, right? And he gave us enough. He gave Martin enough from his own experiences as an exile, including Cambridge and everything that's happening in Cambridge. And so maybe you could tell us later which parts you have marked. It would be interesting, but Nabokov doesn't need my defense here, but I think he's not being negative with respect to his character. He is creating a chess problem for himself. How to create this convincing character whose sensitivity remains raw and flourishing without finding the event that art usually presents something like this. That's how I read it in any case. Sorry, Bonnie, you were onto something else, but.
Oh no, it was also in the foreword when he talks about speak memory. And I think somewhere he might have said, don't go back and look, but every time I saw something that kind of put it in my head, oh yeah, I saw this in speak memory. I saw this in speak memory. So.
Yeah, and you remember trains, for instance, how important trains are, and you have the trains here, and there is a chapter about Cambridge and all that. But I see what he's saying here. It's not going to help you as a reader of this book to read speak memory to understand it. Another interesting thing is he gives us now a whole list of the books, in the Russian books, on the first page in the forward with the ear of their translation. I thought it was Mary that was the last one to be translated, but I realized now rereading this forward that it was precisely this book, Glory, that was the very last one to be translated. And I think he waited with Mary because he was not sure how valuable it would be, how people are going to see it. But with Glory, I think the wait was because it's actually a very difficult book to translate. It is very poetic. And I don't know how much Dimitri worked on it, 3 years, whether he worked all the time or every now and then. But this translation is pretty good. It reads to me like written in English. I don't know. You're qualified evaluators of this, not me. Did you have any translation issues?
I
It's
didn't. I
supposed
thought it was
to be
a very,
translated, yeah, very accurately. No,
yeah.
no rewritings like with King, Queen, Knave or others.
I get the impression from the foreword also that he's very fond of this novel. He may not find it perfect in any way, but when he talks on 11 about soaring to the heights of purity and melancholy that have only attained in the much later Ada. So there's something about this novel that he's very fond of.
Yeah. Suffice it to say that after all, but lapsing into false exoticism or commonplace comedy, it soars to heights of purity and melancholy that I have only attained in the much later Ada. Commonplace comedy and exoticism are obviously the negative qualifier here. The faults of the novel. I mean, he's not going to point out the faults of the novel. He's not going to make it that easy for the critics. Another interesting thing that he says on page 12 is the parenthetical, starting in the third line. I feel obliged to give here the proper determination of this political type, recognized at once with the unconspicuous precision of common knowledge by the Russian intelligence, who was the main reader of my books, the Russian intelligence being the main reader of his books, because I still cannot reconcile myself to the facts, etc. These are, yeah, we're not going to read this, but he writes in Russian for people who are quite educated, actually. The Russian emigre community, even people who he would call bourgeois and not particularly interesting for him, they were a pretty educated audience that he had. Not too many, and it's Germany and France too. This was published first in France, right? Or maybe I'm mistaken now. The very first publication. And for some reason, I thought the first publication was in Podwig. Podwig was big. Okay, well, it's not that important. I'll look it up. Yeah, right there from Paris. So the editor of Remenia Zapisky arrived there from Paris to buy the book in the rooted state. So that's.
I thought his comment about American intellectual thought and its failure to acknowledge the existence of a liberal Russian thought, and I think there's a truth to that. In this country, we looked at it. So when he makes the comment, said you're a Trotskyite, right? So you have anything all the way from Lenin.
Neither this nor that.
Yeah, it's one or the other, but there's no liberal thought, and I think the history of that has been eradicated in this country.
It's interesting also in Europe. In Germany, the Nazis came, and in France, what happened with Stalin was well received, really, by the French intellectuals. So, in a sense, the Russian emigre community was not perceived as representative of Russia by the European countries in which these people tried to live. And that's why I think Nabokov eventually switched to English, not only because he was coming to live in the United States, but because he didn't have an audience, really, a very limited audience. And if he taught his son Dmitry to read Russian and to love Russian literature, this didn't happen to every single Russian kid born in immigration. So a whole generation of Russians born abroad was lost to the Russian culture. That's important too. Okay, but let's discuss the character. Yeah, Ed, you were about to say something else.
I was just going to add one more thing to kind of supplement this notion of him pointing out that there's no talent, which is I also kind of felt some hope, and it's right under where Jerry talked about the Trotskyites. Like I get a sense, like the first four novels, we really have kind of these lonely young men who don't appear to be particularly happy. And at least here, Nabokov indicates that, okay, maybe he doesn't have the talent, but there does seem to be some fulfillment here. Like he actually is going to live out his dreams. And I'm very curious, what it is that he finally will point the reader to that kind of creates a happy environment for any of these, well, frankly, any of his characters, but certainly the lead characters who are young men that seem to be struggling. So while I was checking, the Martin's talents, I was also very thrilled that maybe there might be a happier ending to this one.
I think that's his trap. That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that's the trap.
Oh, darn him.
Depends what you call a happy ending. In a sense, Lolita has a happy ending because finally Humbert realizes what he has done to her, right? Is it happy ending? She dies in childbirth, but he realizes. Or Ada or Arder, it's a love story that lasts not 95 years, but about 90 years. Well, that's something, right? Okay, anything else related to the preface? He explains the choice of title. I think it should be, I don't think exploit exactly is what Podvig is. It's something heroic, a heroic exploit. And there will be something here that qualifies.
That's very interesting because I took the meaning of exploit in English to be taking advantage of, or some type of instrumental way of using something, where an exploit, that makes much more sense now. And
that's the verb, right? The verb has
to
this
exploit,
meaning, right? To exploit, but an exploit is a feat, an adventure.
Yes.
It's not used today, right? The exploits of Hercules.
No, not really. But that's very helpful because
But I think in Russian, the word Podvig has a heroic connotation, doing something above and beyond the average, something that requires courage, maybe self-sacrifice, some kind of integrity. That's what it means in Russian. But he's chosen glory, I think. Well, it is where those heroic exploits would lead to glory, right? It's the related word. And another thing is happening here. We have a Swiss character, right? Half Swiss. The grandpa is Swiss. And Nabokov probably is not yet thinking that he would live the last 16 years of his life in Switzerland. But we see what Switzerland seemed to him when he probably chose to go there. It's almost like a never land, somehow outside of history too. It's nature above all. Again, he speaks about this in the preface, how different this father and mother are from his parents, just emphasizing this. But it is interesting to discuss the role of the mother in the formation of this character. Mostly the mother, because they separated with the father quite early. If you want to spend some time on this.
But they never said what the father had done, but they made it sound like it was something worse than an affair, because I mean, affairs were fairly common and women weren't divorcing. And I just didn't know if it was.
Yeah, I wonder what your impression is. Maybe to this woman, it meant something else. I mean, the estrangement she's talking about, maybe she simply felt like she didn't need him.
Okay.
I don't know. It's curious because the character of the mother is very important here. And the fact that she introduces him to English literature and Englishness and kind of despises the French lifestyle, way of being, and diminutives of any kind. She has almost a manly values of sorts, right? There are several things here about her. She's riding her bicycle. She walks a lot on foot, reads books to him in English, detests diminutives of any kind, which if you detest diminutives and speak English, nobody will notice. But if you detest diminutives and speak Russian, it will be a very dry speech, very awkward language, because everything would feel kind of rough and harsh. Lisping words, moralizing, things that she despised. She despised Russian folk stories, the Russian fables about animals. She believed that Pushkin's enchantment with his nanny, who is supposed to have told him many folk stories, actually is, I can't remember the exact words, not overrated, but
Invented.
And it could well be at least partially invented. I mean, mythologizing one's nanny is a model. So all this, there is something about the mother that seems to fit better with a father image. Yeah, Ed.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, when he starts to have his first affair with Alla, I think it is, she kind of makes it known that she's both pleased and unpleased, but it seems as if she is comfortable with it because she's kind of, I think she says she's almost proud of his kind of manliness that he is being displayed in, what he's doing. And I'm not a father myself, but that seems kind of like more a fatherly thing than a motherly thing to be worried that
Right.
he might get hurt by an older woman, or maybe this is not good generally.
Oh, actually, this was really the model in Russian and French society for a young man to learn about it. He has to fall in love with a younger woman. I mean, Balzac, for instance, a young man entering society has to find a woman to kind of introduce him. And that happens through some kind of a liaison. It could be consummated, not consummated, but how does it matter? Tolstoy's own aunt, the one who raised him because his parents were both dead, said that the best thing that can happen to him is to fall in love with an older woman in order to mature. And so Tolstoy makes Vronsky fall in love with Anna, who is a couple of years, 3 years, I think, older. So this was a model, and something that was to pass, something temporary, just an initiation of sorts. She praises him for having been in love to his uncle, or the cousin of Henry, or Henri. Okay, any other preliminary thoughts? There is a revolution here happening. When was he born? Can we tell? When his father dies, they learn that the father is, Jerry, your mic. No worries, you can cough.
So sorry.
You can cough if you need.
There's a reference, I think, to his being 17 in 1919 in the Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that means he would have been born around 1902.
And on page 7, a day after he left for St. Petersburg and never returned. Just a second, Martin. Maybe we should read this a little bit, because that's the beginning of World War I, and he's 11. Yeah. So that's he was very affectionate and polite with his father. Maybe just read a little bit here, Ed, in section 3, page 7. Martin, on the other hand, was very affectionate.
Martin, on the other hand, was very affectionate and polite with his father, so as to mitigate the punishment as much as possible, since he believed that his father had been banished for a misdemeanor committed one summer evening at their country house, when he had done something to the piano that made it emit an absolutely staggering sound, as if someone had stepped on its tail, and the day after had left for St. Petersburg and never returned. This happened in the very same year when the Grand Duke of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. Martin imagined that Sarajevo on its divan very distinctly, with the Grand Duke in a plumed hat defending himself with a sword against half a dozen black-cloaked conspirators, and was disappointed when his error became evident.
Okay, let's stop here. Just we can talk about the piano separately. but it's worth discussing it a little bit because of Nabokov's mastery to introduce details. So Martin is spending some time with his father, right? And is very affectionate and polite to make up for this banishment for a misdemeanor committed one summer evening on the piano. The piano was the problem because that's what he heard of the whole conversation. But within this, what's introduced is the date, the 20, the day after is the 29th of June, 1914. This the assassination is on the 28th. So we know the specific date when this has happened, the next day. And on the one hand, we have something very intimate. It's the parents quarreling and something inexplicable is happening. And on the other hand, we have an event that was the beginning of World War I in the same sentence. And how does he achieve the merger is through this romantic vision, again, of the seraglio. I mean, it's a parallel to the piano. What he remembers about the terrible thing that happened to the piano, what his father did, is in parallel with the assassination of the Grand Duke in the seraglio. And he imagines those conspirators and all that. So what we see here is how his imagination supplements reality. His imagination is just so active. His life is very interesting because he has to find an explanation of everything, and he employs his imagination, and not an explanation like logical cause effect, but he didn't ask his mother what happened. Why did father do this thing to the piano? But he kind of supplements something, feelings, images, that seems to be going on throughout the book. And that's the imagination of this character is very different from the imagination of the narrator, of the eye, and Smurov's imagination in this respect. We know the things that he imagines are not true, and at the same time, we have the sense of reality.
So different than illusions.
Yeah, say more about the difference if you want to.
Oh, well, they weren't real. I mean, they were like the chess problems overtaking, and it wasn't, these to me are more adventurous, like he read in the books because he read Kipling and he read some of those other books. So if you could say more realistic imagination, that were illusions were just more very focused on chess and seemed more surreal.
Yeah, it was very abstract, right? It had rules within the rules, and this meant a closed imagination that's not open to the world, just the opposite. He looked into the real world for chess problems.
Right.
Okay. So we know a lot about the character and his childhood just within 3 chapters. And the father's death happening in the 3rd one, there in Yalta. And the serious stuff seems to start here with the death of his father somehow. I would say somewhere in the last paragraph on page 8. Nabokov makes him on purpose 3 or 4 years older than himself, and this immediately puts him in a different category. So say on page 9 down there, if you were 20 instead of 15 in 1919, if you were 20, if you were Nabokov's age, the last sentence on page 9 said his mother, if you had already finished high school, you could join the White Army. But you can't now, you're too young for this. So I wonder why he's given Martin so much of his own experiences, but has made it impossible for him to join the whites. And Nabokov doesn't join the whites. His characters speculate about this possibility. The Lev Shestov in Mary might have joined the whites, right? And he had the Polish passport. Not Lev Shestov, sorry, Lev.
Gannon?
No, Gannon, his last name, Lev Glebovich.
Yep.
Yeah. Lev Glebovich. So for some reason, he doesn't want this to be a possibility for the character to join the whites at this point. That would have been a natural thing for somebody of his upbringing if he were in Yalta. So I had some things that I want to propose that we discuss, speaking of Nabokov's style and the way the fabric of this narrative is woven. It is different from the previous books, I think. But do you have any thoughts on what is happening in this portion of the book that you want to discuss before we start talking about style mostly and mastery?
I mean, I'm happy to kind of a couple of things that were pretty compelling that I'd love to discuss and hear what folks think. Is the scene where his mother beats him and that he kind of accepts it and is very sort of stoic about the punishment. So, you know, how that kind of led to generally his ability to control his passions.
Yeah, let's read this passage because there's so much in it. Do you have the page? I think I have it somewhere.
I think it's 13.
Yeah. Because a lot actually is caused by this quality of his character. So I have marked it as one of the things to read anyway here. So maybe starting from the beginning of chapter 4, because things are very much related. Ed, would you like to start reading?
He did not inform either Lita or her brother of his father's death, since he doubted that he could utter the news naturally, while it would have been indecorous to tell it with feeling. From early childhood, his mother had taught him that to discuss in public a profound emotional experience, which in the open air immediately evanesces and fades, and oddly becomes similar to an analogous experience of one's interlocutor, was not only vulgar, but also a sin against sentiment. She detested the ribbons of funeral wreaths with silver inscriptions such as "To a Young Hero" or "To Our Unforgettable Darling Daughter," and disapproved of sedate but mawkish people who, when they lose a dear one, find it possible to shed tears in public on another moment, on a day of good luck, even though bursting with joy, they would never allow themselves to break out laughing in a passing stranger's face. Once, when Martin was about 8, he had attempted to shear the hair off a shaggy little dog and had inadvertently cut its ear. Embarrassed for some reason to explain that he simply had intended to snip off the excess tufts, before painting it to look like a tiger, Martin met his mother's indignation with stoic silence. She ordered him to lower his pants and lie down prone. He did so in complete silence, and in complete silence she whipped him with a riding switch of tawny bullgut. Then he pulled up his pants and she helped him button them to his little undervest as he had begun doing it askew, and then went out and only there in the park let himself go wailing his heart out, the tears mixed with bilberries. Meanwhile, his mother was weeping in her bedroom in the evening. She was barely able to hold back new tears as a very cheerful and plump Martin sat in the tub, nudging along a celluloid swan, and presently stood up to let his back be lathered, and she saw the vivid pink stripes on his tender buttocks. Such chastisement took place only once, nor did Sophia ever lift her hand, threatening to slap him for this or that petty misdemeanor as French and German mothers do.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, content-wise, any questions, any thoughts? Corporal punishment was a part of the system, obviously. The mother behaved a little bit like a man here too, like the father, but wait a second. So when the father leaves them, Martin is much older. So the father was present in the family when he was 8, right? When he was 11, the father leaves. If he was born in 1903, the father was still at home, or they were not officially separated. So anyway, you had wanted to discuss this for a reason or two.
Well, this was one of my check marks for kind of his talent in that, like, I mean, it really is, I think, pretty amazing that, or maybe it's not that 8-year-old who in the afternoon has been beaten and then sort of that evening really holds zero sort of grudge against his mother and is kind of.
But let's discuss why. So first of all, with respect to talent, I just realized that Nabokov means artistic talent.
Yeah.
And so probably he has some kind of talent exhibited here, but certainly I won't call it artistic talent.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I took it when I was making my check marks as more of something of note.
But why is he so cheerful and plump, Martin, in the evening after this punishment? How plausible psychologically is this thing?
I think that was my point. I don't, it doesn't seem very plausible at all. But except, maybe he recognizes that her, I mean, to some extent, she immediately kind of I don't know, repent's the right word, but like she is certainly not doing it out of any anger, doing it as kind of a lesson. And her sort of crying after the fact, kind of indicates it, at least at the time, she thought she was doing it for his benefit, maybe. And does he recognize
Martin doesn't know that she's crying, right? They're both crying separately, Martin in the park and she in her room. But let's discuss, let's step in Martin's shoes. He knows he didn't intend to hurt the dog, right? He knows that he's punished for something, that he has guilt. He's not guilty. He has not committed the crime for which he's being punished. But if he had committed it, it would have been just, right? If he tortured the little dog, cutting the dog's ear to cause pain or just because of lack of sensitivity, it would have been a punishable transgression. So the mother thinks she's teaching him a lesson because she's causing pain where he caused pain, supposedly to the dog intentionally. But Martin knows he has not caused the pain, but he has done something else. He has stoically accepted this punishment without looking for an excuse, a justification. This is a pretty manly behavior. I don't know if it makes sense to you, but that's my explanation of this passage, that he's a child. He cries because he feels he's unjustly punished, but he knows that his mother did not know that he was unjustly punished. So once he cries, he's cheerful, because what remains is his courage to undergo the punishment without crying. Then he didn't cry. He didn't try to find an excuse. The deed was done. The dog really suffered, regardless of whether he intended to do this to the dog or not. The truth is the dog got his ear cut. So I'm thinking it is incredible that the child would perceive the complexity of the situation here. In this sense, it is a talent, but to me, it's psychologically very plausible, actually. Bonnie.
But then how do you explain, if you keep reading in the next chapter, that he worries about, his big worry is about being seen as unmanly or being a coward.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't have thought, did he start having these feelings about being manly and not showing emotion this early?
Most likely, yeah. I think maybe because he's not really raised by a man, but by a woman on one hand, but this woman tries to raise him as a man and not as a sensitive, girlish little guy. I don't think there is a contradiction. She's preoccupied. He's preoccupied somehow with behaving in the right manly way, and this becomes one of his complexes of sorts. And as we see later, this is just so important to him. In this respect, there are similarities with the eye, the self-observation, the self-awareness of the character. There is something little here. Yes, Ed?
Yeah, in the sort of the follow-up episode where he kind of late at night runs into the drunken fella who threatens him, and it's probably not his best moment in terms of his most manly or courageous effort. He goes through his head like, what should he do in this instance, which is pretty interesting in its own right. But I think he knows when he kind of escapes that scenario that that was kind of a missed opportunity to do the things that he most wants to do, which is kind of show himself to be courageous. And I mean, for a young child to do that at 14 or whatever he is, I think already exhibiting this, need to show himself and the worth associated with his manliness, I think is important. And he will wind up kind of embellishing that episode over time. But the recognition that he both failed and but it's what he wants to do. Like, and it's kind of noble in its own way.
Do you think that the fact that this comes from his mother and the reading the books somehow affects his sensitivity to how well he's able to perform as a man? There is something, I mean, he doesn't really have a model. The model is abstract. It's the mother's ideal, the books that she reads to him. Sorry, Bonnie, I'm talking too much. You probably, your mic.
No, I had nothing to, no, I just moved my arm.
Okay, so yeah, that's a very interesting point. The heroic deeds, the idea of heroic deeds.
I mean, in his imagination, through this reading of the books, he imagines himself, a pirate. He imagines himself kind of an adventurer, an explorer. Even escaping from labor camps, I think is another one. And the actual episode where he tries to be courageous is part and parcel of that kind of imaginative development, I think, where he wants to be a noble, courageous man.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this? This seems to be the theme of the Bildungsroman, the story of a young man who is coming of age and building his own character with some self-awareness. But it's usually happening through some serious exploits, heroic exploits. And here, so far, what we have is sensitivity that allows him to experience it on a very mundane level. Nothing big is, there is a revolution, but in their escape, what happens? He conquers Allah. That's his greatest thing. So, and that's not shown as a parody or anything. I'm inclined to see it more as affirmative take on the growing up, on initiation. You don't need to face the greatest tragedy in order to grow. It's more like how you do it rather than what you have to overcome. There is some such sense here. In my reading, might not be everybody's. So the presence, and speaking of this, the presence of the historical events, there is a revolution, people are escaping, his father has died, we don't know exactly the circumstances, really. Was he killed by the Reds? What happened? It's not very clear. it could be otherwise if they hadn't separated, maybe. But what else do we know about the events? They're big historical events. Yalta is described a little bit like Alexandria, one of those great cities that somehow have a character that affects the people in them. Does it look like an adventure to you, their escape through Istanbul and then Athens, and the fact that this couple, Ala and her husband, who resembles Kashmarin a little bit, maybe, but nothing else happens beside this. And in Athens, the first kiss happens. The next step towards manliness is made. I have a mistress, right? Page 38. So Chernusvitov, the name of Allah and her husband, means black light, dark light, something like this, if it is of any importance. It's a strange name, actually.
And the strange arrangement of the husband coming to sleep with Martin, and he really is presented as kind of a clueless character.
Yeah, clueless or indifferent to.
Or indifferent, right?
Yeah.
And his biggest concern.
Business, right? They're concerned with some business issues more than anything else. But so, do you find the arrangement as strange as to be implausible, or you're just noticing it?
Yeah.
Considering how bad the room was that his mother was able to procure in comparison to Alice's room, and they knew each other from the ship, and I guess Chernusvitov said, I don't care, actually, if you want to invite her. It's just treating the mother as a lady, offering her a chair. It's almost like, okay, there are two chairs. Chernusvitov and Ala are sitting. Miss Edelweiss enters and he offers his chair. Ala probably uses her elbow to remind him that this is expected, but so it's not a strange arrangement in itself, but it creates a strange situation, right? Because if he had a room of his own and Allah was visiting him in his room, it would be one thing, but it would be more difficult with the mother there, right? It's in a sense, it's a better opportunity, but also at the end, something else happens that he doesn't quite understand. There were several things that seemed to be very indicative of this character, and I, for instance, wanted to point out to just half a sentence maybe at the end, the very end of chapter 5, which is this intensification of all senses, which seems to permeate the whole narrative, some kind of very intense perception of the world. And the ending on page 20, Martin again experienced the feeling he had known on more than one occasion as a child, an unbearable intensification of all his senses, a magical and demanding impulse, the presence of something for which alone it was worth living. And you can say this is because he's very young and he has lots of new experiences. It's not a tragedy that they are running away. He never loved his father too much to feel like this is a terrible loss. There are explanations, but this intensity seems very important.
He seems to notice all the beauty in nature, and nature seems so far to be an important part, because I think doesn't his mom talk about church or God in kind of like a natural or naturalism?
Yeah.
And it struck me that there was a lot of, he noticed nature a lot.
Yeah, the villa, the Andres villa, where he visits, where Lida's mother lives and receives everybody, all the numerous guests, and this is going there and leaving seems to be quite an experience precisely of nature. Maybe
and I think when his mom, after his father dies and his mother, they were talking about something with God, and it's like the power had no connection with the church.
Yeah.
It was more like the presence of a tree or a cloud or a dog. And it just kind of struck me as more like kind of like naturalism. And
right. It's yeah, it's almost some kind of pantheistic vision of the world where God is everything in everything, especially in nature in this case. So we have a little bit, oh, go ahead, Dad.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what to make of it, but on page 34, he talks about when he was young and he was, I guess, in some theater production, and he finds himself in a closet with, one of his fellow actors, and he talks about how, that potential experience of maybe whether it's kissing or otherwise, that wasn't sufficiently romantic for him. He was more thrilled by reading some of the novels than he was of being alone in an actual situation with a woman that he could actually have some connection with, and so the passage about how the erotic thrill for him was kind of this remote, the forbidden, and the vague. It almost seems as if it's more like in his head than it is if he can act it out to some extent. Like he would rather it be in his imagination than even the potential of acting on it. At least that's kind of how I took that passage.
Well, I mean, just consider with the imagination, you could do so much more than acting in reality, so it's kind of appealing. Well, whether this is the case, whether this needs to be the case with an imaginative person like this, I don't know. I don't find it implausible, but it's also the way a writer would see reality, because reality is always limited. Whatever imagination can offer, if it is powerful, is always more. It can alter reality as well. Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted also to talk, maybe not yet there. We're not yet there, but we don't have that much time. So we have to talk about Switzerland precisely as a follow-up on what you said, Ed. Switzerland has nature, right? But it also has a peculiar dullness to it. It's not Istanbul. And Henry, I mean, everything's ordered and nice, and he used to go to the university in Geneva and all that, but somehow it's not inspiring enough. So I thought maybe Switzerland is not the perfect place for somebody like him. I just wanted us to read a couple of moments. One of them is on page 49, when he's in Switzerland now with Uncle Henry, and this experience of opulent solitude. The opulent solitude that's in the very middle of the page, maybe we could read. I think it's a very, very long paragraph. It continues to the end of the chapter. I think this, along with the unbearable intensification of the senses, kind of form his character, or maybe he already has it in him and he discovers it somehow. But if you don't mind reading a little bit here, the word happiness actually is used in the beginning of chapter 11 on the way home. Bonnie, would you start here just for a little while, and then
on the way home?
Yeah, the very beginning.
Okay. On the way home, he mentally replayed every shot, transforming defeat into victory and then shaking his head. How very, very hard it was to capture happiness. Brooks burbled, concealed among the foliage. Blue butterflies fluttered up from damp spots on the road. Birds bustled in the bushes. Everything was depressingly sunny and carefree. That evening after dinner, they sat as usual in the drawing room. The door to the piazza was wide open, and since there had been a power failure, candles burned in the chandeliers.
Okay, let's stop here. He's talking then about Maupassant's novel Bellamy that he's reading. But how difficult it is to capture happiness and then depressingly sunny and carefree. That's precisely a little bit like being locked in the closet with a girl that's appealing. It is there. But later, tired of reading, I wanted to continue here. Bonnie, if you want to continue, just the new paragraph on page 48.
Oh. Tired of reading, Martin stretched and went out on the terrace. It was very dark, and the air smelled of dampness and night-blooming flowers. A star fell, as so often annoyingly happens. It fell not quite in his field of vision, but off to the side, so that his eye caught only the twinge of a soundless change in the sky. The outlines of the mountains were indistinct, and here and there, in the folds of darkness, dots of light scintillated in twos and threes. Travel, said Martin softly, and he repeated this word for a long time until he had squeezed all meaning out of it, upon which he set aside the long, silky skin it had shed. And next moment, the word had returned to life. Star, mist, velvet, travelvet. He would articulate carefully and marvel every time how tenuously the sense endures in the sound. In what a remote spot this young man had arrived, what far lands he had already seen, and what was he doing here at night in the mountains, and why was everything in the world so strange, so thrillful? Thrillful, Martin repeated aloud and liked the word. Another star went tumbling. He fixed his eyes on the sky as, once upon a time, when they were driving home in the Victoria from a neighbor's estate along a dark forest road, a very small Martin, rocking on the brink of slumber, would throw back his head and watch the heavenly river between the amassments of trees along which he was floating. Where again in his life, he wondered, would he gaze, as then as now, at the night sky? On what pier, at what station, in what town square?
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie.
A feeling of opulent solitude, which he often had experienced amid crowds, the delight he took in saying to himself, not one of these people going about their business knows who I am, where I'm from, what I'm thinking about right now. This feeling was indispensable to complete happiness, and Martin, in a breathless trance, imagined how completely alone in a strange city, say London, he would roam at night along unfamiliar streets. He saw the black, handsome cab splashing through the fog, a policeman in a shiny black cape, lights on the Thames, and other images out of English novels. He had left his luggage at the station and was walking past innumerable illuminated English shops, excitedly looking for Isabel, Nina, Margaret, someone whose name he could give to that night. And she, who would she think he was? An artist, a sailor, a gentleman burglar? She would not accept his money. She would be tender, and in the morning, she would not want to let him go. How foggy the streets were, though, and how crowded and how difficult the search. And although there was much that looked different and the hansoms were mostly extinct, he nevertheless recognized certain things. On one autumn evening, he walked baggageless at a Victoria station. He recognized the dark, greasy air, the bobby's wet oilskin cape, the reflections, the swashy sounds.
Okay, let's stop here because it's an endless paragraph. But so several things, but one of them is what happens with time and space.
Mm-hmm.
He is tired of reading and thinking of travel and inventing thrillful words. And then the feeling of opulent solitude that he remembers from being in crowds. And then imagining himself in London. And all of a sudden he's in London. That's a very Nabokovian leap, as we know. We've seen it before. But what does it do for us here? And next thing, of course, he finds a prostitute. He spends the night with her. Luckily, she takes only 10 pounds, which is good. He's happy, and his new life has begun. But what takes him there? We are told about how much he loves the train and just traveling on a train since childhood and all that. Going to Biarritz exactly the way the Nabokov went to Biarritz. But something is happening here that is different from a train. Or maybe it's a train of something else.
Well, having just spent some time with Harry Potter, It's almost as if we're taking this leap through time, because it was very difficult for me to try and pinpoint exactly where the imagination ended and the reality began. I mean, as soon as he talks about London, he's still, just prior to that, he's in a breathless trance.
Yeah, he says a strange city, say London. It's still the imagination.
Yeah, imagination, right.
And so he continues imagining London, and who would she think he is? An artist, a sailor? She would not accept his money, etc. And then how foggy the streets were. I think somewhere here, how foggy the transition is happening, but it's very difficult to tell at what moment his imagination has let reality in.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it doesn't happen that way in life. We don't transport ourselves that way, but the description is very powerful, because to him, objectively, this is how it happens. I mean, he's thinking of traveling as something that defines him. And here he is, transported. And
that's a good word, though, transported, because that's exactly how it feels, as if he's transported from the imagination to reality.
Yeah. When he sees the prostitute, should he quietly take a taxi, forget about the imaginary night, and then cowardliness and betrayal? I personally am reminded of the first night of France's first night in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, that was his plan, but
till he broke his glasses.
Well, yeah. In any case, it's somehow when you compare him with other characters that Nabokov has created by this point, somehow this one feels much more cheerful and appealing, somehow compelling, as Ed already pointed out. There is ease and genuine drive in whatever he does. It's curiosity that drives him somehow. Granted that he's very concerned how he looks, whether he's courageous. Cowardliness and betrayal, Martin said softly. These are the two horror words, cowardliness and betrayal.
I mean, I'm sure we'll get to it, next time around, but the sort of stark contrast between him and his sort of friend, Darwin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't really need the same kind of imagination, because it seems like he's already done it and is more willing to kind of sit on that performance of his, while Martin again needs to exploit. I'll use that. I mean, he needs to have people think that he has done these things, or he needs to embellish things, whereas Darwin is the exact opposite, even though he's done everything that probably Martin wants to do.
Yeah, Darwin is a little bit of an enigma at this point. We can talk more about him later, because he has been there, done it already, and but he has sympathy for Martin. Obviously, there is some kind of chemistry there. I really love the picture of Cambridge so far, with the way Darwin, for instance, tells him the rules. Mm-hmm. And the irony behind it. And then the tutor, he will end up probably more interested in Russian literature at this point than anything else. But the fact that he can choose, that everything seems very appealing to him because it is equally curious and might be heroic to discover something new in science, or just be somebody, become somebody. Yeah, that's I think for all of us this is moving, because it's really what youth is about. It's about discovering your potential and what you can do with it. So we will talk about Darwin. Anything else in the earlier chapters that is important but we missed it, and I'll take a note so that we could return to it. The Russian family is important in London as a part of the general picture, but this will come back with especially one person in the Russian family. So we have another Russian family here, and we have this young man who is visiting.
We didn't talk much about Uncle Henry.
Yeah.
That presumably will play some role, at least in kind of sustaining them, it appears. I don't know exactly, but
yeah, the sentimentality of Uncle Henry, as opposed to Men Don't Cry, the Men Don't Cry early sentimental education of Martin. So that's interesting. And
yeah, I mean, there seems to be some like contrast where the gifts that he gives to Martin doesn't really appreciate, and it's kind of setting it up for the contrast between the two.
Yeah, but most of all, the sentimentality of the uncle, it looks like it's something strange to him. And there is something about Switzerland. It feels like in its peace and quiet and prosperity, there is kind of characterlessness of sorts. But yeah, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Yeah, anything else that I need to take a note of? Well, then maybe we should stop here. If you remember something, you can always bring it up in the beginning of the next class or email me. But I thought this sense of opulent solitude that he exhibits is what characterizes him, and the engagement with the world in a very genuine, direct way. And if he were if he had artistic talent, this would be compromised, because then the world will become a material for his art. And now the world, it's him and the world, everything is genuine. So maybe that's also Nabokov's dream of living a life of no writing, just experiencing life the way it is.
And Katya, I'm sorry, did you say engagement with the world directly?
Right.
Versus indirectly, okay. Yeah.
Versus if he had artistic talent, whatever he lives, he would turn into art. Yeah. And it would be interesting as material for art above all, not in itself.
He was interested in the particulars, like the objects, and that kind of goes with Darwin, because Darwin wrote that book that was just like descriptions, like the corkscrew. So they both kind of were interested in just objects.
Right, but Darwin might have the English eccentricity and sense of humor that has led to these books, probably. And we don't know what his pieces really were about. They were little essays, but I'm sure he starts with a corkscrew and goes who knows where with this. Okay, so yeah, I think Nabokov is doing a very interesting experiment. This is a version of him, like with Smurov, a version of him without, not without talent exactly, but without artistic talent that is realized in works of art. And maybe this is, I don't know, this might be preferable, who knows? It's hard to be an artist. You don't really live your life. Nabokov has spoken about it, but hey, there are other pluses. Okay, we're already beyond our time, and thank you for your patience. So I'll see you in a week, and we continue what is the title, Podvik or Glory. Podvik is the Russian word. You can learn a Russian word. Okay.
Have a good week.
Okay, thank you. Good night.